Hey everybody. How are you guys doing? I hope everyone's doing well. Can't believe it's already February. Crazy actually how fast time's going, to be honest. And I don't feel like I've done much, so maybe that's just on me. Maybe I need to be doing more. But I don't know. I just scheduled a bunch of stuff, and everywhere I look, it's really just delayed. Like crowded. I wanted to, sign up for a new gym membership and kind of start exercising again because it's been years, frankly. Probably maybe like a decade. Be honest, I last worked out, so. And when I say worked out, I mean I get a little bit of exercise. Certainly, haven't been sitting, not doing anything, eating junk food for a decade. But I definitely haven't made a consistent effort to to work out at all. You know, I think, well, I mean, I was patting myself on the back, generally speaking, for managing to fit in about 10 minutes a day, maybe 4 days a week. I thought that was pretty good. And it wasn't even really exercise, it was just stretching. And it wasn't even really stretching all of my muscles even. So, I got a long way to go. Definitely definitely want to make those improvements though. I was going to the gym. Well, I was going to go to the gym. And as I'm going through it, looking at the prices, I'm thinking to myself, you know, if I make a habit of it, I can maybe make it worth it. But if I don't make a habit of it, it's not worth it at all. And so I was looking, and in order to make a habit, you obviously have to be able to fit it into your schedule. I was looking at the schedule, and for the life of me, I couldn't tell if these were times that were open to the public or if these were times that were not open to the public. It wasn't really clear on the schedule whether these were publicly available moments or if these were blocked from public. They were just big, you know, time slots that took up huge parts of the schedule. And it wasn't quite clear if this was booked up, and I couldn't really figure out who to ask. And then I was talking to somebody, and they said it was kind of difficult, and you had to check the times and make sure things were working. So I held off. I didn't get the membership because, well, frankly, I know how hard it is to quit those things. I really just didn't want to have to quit something and not really be able to get any use out of it. Now that I am gonna go back at some point and get their, I guess they have this kind of trial pass. So I'm gonna try the trial pass because that is it's non-committal. There's no contract. You just kind of buy it and you use it. But it's kind of time sensitive, so you have to use it within a certain time period, and that's fine. Because my goal is to kind of build up the habit, and if I have to spend a little bit extra to get started, and it's worth it, and I like the habit, I don't mind because ultimately, in the long run, the amount of extra time I get to do that hobby, that thing that I love, is well worth whatever the little bit of extra cost is. Now, that's assuming it's reasonable. There's a lot of hobbies I haven't started because I just can't even afford the starter pack, you know? I'm working my way up to some of those starter packs, but generally speaking, as it stands, I think we all start somewhere. I don't necessarily think we all start in the same place, that's for sure. A lot of people aren't necessarily aware of what has been given to them at their starting point because they're kind of brought into that standard. They assume that the standard is the standard. And yet the standard varies across the board. If you ask anybody what the standard means, unless there's some sort of regulatory body or it's a well-defined meaning, everyone's ideas are going to generally be really different. And I find the same thing goes for your starting point. You don't necessarily have access to all the same materials. And so somebody that, say, gets started early on in a hobby doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're better than anybody else, or I mean, they might be. There's no discounting that fact either by the very nature. It's kind of an independent variable. It doesn't really matter. You can have people that are, 50, 60 years old that are just killing it. They're still better than somebody who's, say, 30 across the board. There are some champions that have just still got a certain amount of skill. Now, how many more years before they start to move on down, who knows? And it's hard to always say if the entire, I guess, field has been played. There are lots of places that don't get the spotlight. There's lots of people that go unnoticed. And I think in general, in sports, we tend to focus on those people who have achieved sponsorship. So they've been acknowledged to some degree already by the time we see them. We don't really participate in the early stages. Now, in some sports, that's been changed. I mean, there's somewhat of a media pipeline that you see in, say, American football, where from high school to college to the NFL, there might be somewhat of a media empire all along the way there, and a ramp of sorts from one into the next, a feeder, if you will, depending on how you want to think about it. And there are certainly feeders in pretty much any professional sport. They just don't necessarily get the same amount of media coverage. Hockey, for example, has lots of feeder leagues, lots of feeder championships, and whatnot. And lots of people will work their way up to get into, at least a chance to go for the national. But at the same time, a lot of those people end up playing in the amateur leagues, and, and unless there's some level of sponsorship, those leagues don't seem to get the coverage that, say, the NFL or the NHL or the NBA or any of those would get. And the big reason is the advertisers are the reason that you are paying attention to those leagues in the first place. It's not necessarily why you think they're important. For example, somewhat intrinsically, the importance comes out of just being popular. Because not because that person is actually important, but because so many people give them importance that they're able to use it and leverage it. But if people didn't give them the importance, they wouldn't have it because it's not intrinsically there. It's something that kind of comes up in the interaction it's spurred on initially usually by advertising or sponsorship or something, or a predetermined system. For example, in the NFL, everyone tunes in, they watch the NFL branded games. And while it could be any new slot of players after 10 years, and maybe the entire rosters are completely different, nobody has, any similarities anymore, the brand is still there. The advertisers are still selling, the Eagles or the Falcons or whatever, and they're always kind of pushing that advertising. And so, for good and bad, it gives you this kind of anchor to hold on to. Generations can go by cheering for the same team, and that in turn is what makes those teams important because now it's a family bond that has gone over generations. It doesn't really matter to them who owns the team. What matters is the idea of the team, the concept. And to them, they would believe that the owners would value that as well. And so there's this sort of bond, this unspoken contract, typically between fans and the empires that they fuel. And if this contract is upheld, um, between the fans and I guess, the brand, things tend to go really well. You see growth, or at least a strong maintenance. People aren't leaving your brand, that you have loyalty, you have retention, and people are proud to be fans of that brand because it means something and it's somewhat held true over time. But if a brand starts to waver in its trust amongst its fans in some way through either a scandal or just a slow degradation of quality or values changing over time, then you can have a reversal. And companies can instead start to wither. And brands that were once powerful and once loved by their loyal fan base can see their fans turn on them. And many would say that that is the idea coming to an end, that somehow the concept had failed. But I take a different view. I personally think that in those cases, the idea itself was forgotten or neglected by the brand. The very thing that strengthened it didn't go away, it didn't disappear, and while it could possibly shift around or be optimized or change in some way over time, brand loyalty tends to be rooted in what made the brand successful in the first place, and it's not the future. Now, some brands do build up a reputation of potential. I would say in the past, those brands were given somewhat of a deadline with their social contract if they were a company of potential. They were expected to have returns, some sort of proof that they were, in fact, building the future. Because potential just can't stay potential. It has to be realized at some point to be actionable, to be valuable, right? You have to extract something out of those mines at some point for it to have value. You might not want to do it right away. It might not be the best time to do it. It might be best done in, stages or what have you. But generally speaking, at some point, potential has to be realized for it to be useful. And that is when we convert it into some sort of realized benefit or profit or whatever. And hopefully that profits for society at large, right? That's, I think, another unspoken thing is that I think most people ideally don't I mean, they want to profit, and they are not asking to be unjustly rewarded for something that they didn't contribute to. That's not exactly what's being done here. But all of society at all time is always contributing something. We're always doing something for one another, good and bad. And so, assuming the good parts are balanced and found to be in excess of the bad, we feel that in general there should be some reward for that goodness. And most people do good, or at least don't do bad. And that tends to lead to progress. But there's somewhat of a contract there. Society used to realize this, especially in small groups. It's always recognized because if you don't adhere to this, the group will not remain in stasis. The status quo will not be, static. It needs to adapt after a while because people just don't take to that. So if you have like a group of friends and one of your friends is always screwing over the entire rest of the group, eventually the group doesn't want that to happen anymore. And so they're going to make some sort of adjustment. The way that they'll do it is different, and you'll find people with varying opinions on how to address that, but they'll typically always react to it in some way. Some will maybe ostracize the member, some will try to, say, do an intervention, others may go for a more aggressive approach, some may choose to ignore the issue, but start planning things in secret and using weird codes so that it's not picked up. There's, I don't know. People have different ways of dealing with conflicts when it comes to it, but generally speaking, in those situations, you will always find some sort of reaction brewing. And I think that in society, we as individuals kind of, well, mostly understand our social contract. We follow the law, we go to work, we get a job, we get educated. We used to, generally speaking, then go and have a family, get married, and, uh, kind of repeat the cycle over and over and over. There's been this, malicious assault, I would say, on values in the past. Well, for me, I consider it 15 years. I think the last 15 years or so has been somewhat of an assault in different ways. And it certainly didn't just happen overnight. So, I choose 15 years because I think it lines up quite nicely with some events that occurred, namely the, financial crash and what have you. I think that kind of marked a nice turning point from the last economy to the current economy we find ourselves in. The last economy was one of industry, manufacturing, and it was one that sadly was neglected after the financial crash. And perhaps as a scapegoat, because offshore and outsourcing was so popular for the past, 15 years prior to that, even since the 90s, for sure. I would say that there was this idea that, well, we can move what remaining parts of manufacturing we have overseas, salvage, the scraps, and then sort of pivot into a service economy. And this idea of the service economy was already, I mean, it's been going on for a long time, probably even longer than I've been around. But with the service economy, you find this strange effect. service economy needs walls. It needs to have some sort of boundary between it and the manufacturing economy. And if it doesn't, then there's a problem. At the same time, in theory, the service economy is providing, as its name implies, a service to society and to the economy in general. And so, what that service means obviously varies on a few factors. Manufacturing goes through various stages of innovation and change, but so does service. We think about what service means, it means very different things depending on the community you're in, the culture you're in, and the situation you find yourself in. If you're getting served at a fast food restaurant, you'll have different expectations than if you're at, a fine dining establishment. There's certain expectations that come within the context of the area and the event that's taking place. And I do feel that, I don't know, there's been a shift in the past 15 years where we've just not quite realized the impact of moving to a service economy and getting rid of our manufacturing. It hollowed out a lot of our foundational value. Because value always needs a buyer and a seller. You always need to have somebody buying and selling on both sides of the equation, right? And if you don't have one of those parties, or worse, one of those parties ends up being both sides of the equation, then you don't see growth, and you don't see any sort of change because there isn't really a real transaction going on there. It's been artificially created just for the purpose of stimulating the economy. And so you do need real value. What that means is that you can't have a country be its own customer. It needs to, well, you can under, I guess, very, very ideal theoretical circumstances, but at the size that a country is, you really just can't. You could do it at probably no larger than maybe a town, a village, or I would struggle to even imagine a city-sized ecosystem working at that level. I just think that it's something that self-sufficiency in practice, whatever the group is, only works up to a certain size. And then once you get beyond a certain size, you just have to adapt different structures. I just don't agree with the structures that they've implemented in a lot of places, and especially not the way that they're implemented. I think in principle and in theory, a lot of these are based in sound reasoning. The problem is that just like the tax code, it's easy to manipulate and to take advantage of by certain select parties. Now, it's not easy to take advantage of and manipulate by, say, everybody. The average individual usually won't have the means, but to say that it isn't possible for those with a vested interest and the means is, I think, a bit naive because our entire system is built around kind of moving accountability off into these almost outsourced places. Once you hit the service economy, you're no longer accountable anymore for things that you have to be accountable for in manufacturing. And that's not to say that service economy is somehow a lesser or a, you know, it's that you do need both, but you cannot shift from a manufacturing economy into a service economy. It just doesn't work. And frankly, I don't think you should ever have just one or the other. I think you start as a manufacturing economy and with some labor-based service economy, essentially. You come in at a level of lower skill in an underdeveloped economy because you don't have access to all the technology, all the innovations, say, because it's just too costly to get started. Then, on top of that, you have sort of hybrid economies where you'd have a variety of people that can provide services, a variety of people that can provide some sort of labor um, service. Then you have, let's call that blue collar service, and then you'd have white collar service. But white collar service can only serve people that need that service. They need, right? Like white collar service is rarely a necessity, whereas blue collar service more often than not becomes a necessity. Technology can remove necessity from blue collar service jobs as well, but I mean, for the most part, you tend to need a certain amount of just labor, of just people to help with certain tasks, especially in construction and stuff like that. And I'm kind of lumping in construction workers into the service economy, not into the manufacturing economy. The reason I'm doing that is because I do see construction, specifically in like what I mean by construction, I mean like real estate and housing and even like technically that would include commercial and industrial. But those ones, that's where you do get some domain expertise. So I don't think everyone can do that kind of construction. What I do think though is that um, you can obviously always have a base level of construction workers, residential, up to basic commercial. Um, all of that can obviously be done in any economy because that's the foundation of housing and what have you. The only places where you can't really do that is where the environment is against you, or you don't have the labor, the physical numbers of people to do the work. But generally speaking, that's available to any economy of any size, and so it's also available as you get larger and larger, until the incentive structure breaks down. If you can't incentivize people to do that base labor because it's too, your economy has just completely destroyed its incentive and its value structure, that things are out of whack. And this is what happens in the service economy. See, the service economy, without a backbone on a manufacturing based, real hard economy, especially asset driven, resource driven, I mean, the harder the better ultimately, because those are real assets. Those are things that ultimately fuel everything else. Services will always come on top. But if you remove the bottom out of the country, I mean, you still need to import all of that stuff if you're not, removing it yourself. And so you end up having this problem where, I mean, generally speaking, you've got this outflow of resources that are kind of going out, and then you have this inflow of products and manufacturing or whatever. So that money is going to some economy that's manufacturing it. Whereas with us, we are, as a service economy, in theory, exporting our services to these countries. But here's the problem. What services are these countries most likely to import from us? Right? Like, they need to be ordering stuff from us in order for this to work. And in theory, they have to be ordering more economic value from us than we're offering them. Let me let me ask you something. Why would they hire us to consult after 20 or 30 or 40 years of no domestic manufacturing experience? You know, they're not going to do that. They're not going to eventually hire our services anymore because we're going to be out of touch. They're going to be manufacturing things, and they're going to be doing it on the ground floor. And so, if they're doing it on the ground floor, and they are learning all these things firsthand, at best, what we're getting into the cliff notes. I mean, we might have some consultant on site, but we're not running those operations. So we're not actually fully aware of what's happening. You know, we are mostly aware, but not fully aware. And eventually, over time, that gap widens. Then we no longer know how to manufacture the things anymore because we don't do it. So at best, we are now maybe kind of good at middle managing. We kind of can do the consulting, maybe, but we're losing touch with the actual underlying service. So our quality is going down over time. Now, if that starts to happen, then even the word might get out. The reputation could suffer. And if the reputation suffers, then people are just going to stop buying the product. And in this case, the product is our ideas. People aren't going to want our ideas. If they don't want our ideas anymore, and we're not selling hard products anymore, then we don't seem to have a lot of value to them anymore. And they will have just as many needs for service as we will need. Now, here's the funny thing. They might start to outsource to us. Eventually, in this weird reversal. And it might just continue to cycle. But generally speaking, I think once an economy starts to erode its manufacturing like we did 15 years ago after the financial collapse in 08. And think about that. Just pause for a moment. That was a financial collapse mostly driven by the real estate market, right? Bad mortgages that were all kind of rebundled as debt instruments and what have you, those CDOs or whatever they were. And you've got a whole bunch of companies that essentially were banking on these kind of debt instruments to make the money. And once it was found out that they were all bunk, no one could move this stuff anymore. Nobody wanted it. And they suddenly found out that what they were sitting on was a whole bunch of useless value, right? Like it wasn't good anymore, and it wasn't going to make them any money. But not only that, it caused all these repercussions in the actual housing market itself. Now, Canada somehow managed, through a lot of spending, to mostly avoid a lot of the fallout that was seen with states at the time. But one of the things that I've always felt is that we never really saw the impact. You know, our manufacturing got hollowed out. Our industries were hollowed out. The actual country as a whole, the economy just suffered in a lot of ways. But our housing, that didn't really suffer. But it's due. And I mean, they have been propping it up. When you think about it, like the states prop theirs up with wars, yeah, for their oil and all that in the Middle East, and then that didn't save them. They had a financial collapse. Then a few more wars. Obama comes in. ISIS shows up on the menu, and a little bit of a Mexican beef. They get involved in what, Libya, Syria, oh god, a whole bunch of issues, right? So more war. They funded it with more war. A lot of war, and so you start to realize that maybe the states exporting war, and maybe that's one of the last few areas where there's some innovation going on. But I mean, the states wasn't alone. Canada, for a while there. I mean, we obviously don't think our media coverage is like caring about this topic at all. But I mean, I think that a lot of our money and a lot of our value right now secretly is in war. Because I think where the West does dominate is war. I think we've become masters of it compared to, speaking, I mean, kinetic war. So we are now, we outsourced our manufacturing, but not necessarily weapons manufacturing. Right? We outsourced a lot of manufacturing, but not necessarily weapons. We outsourced a lot of resources and reduced and regulated domestic resources in various ways. People could say to innovation, who knows, right? But generally speaking, what happened. And we also know that there was a little bit of an issue with uh, the tech over the last few years with chip manufacturing, where at some point we outsourced and set up shop in Taiwan, and way back in the day because it was cheap, and essentially made Taiwan this powerhouse of chip design. But now we realize that it's a little far away. There's right next to China. Uh, has grown phenomenally, probably because we moved all the manufacturing there. But they were a big buyer of our consulting for a long time, and when buy it, they just stole a lot of the IP as well. But that's allowed their economy to essentially get all the benefits of a service economy with all the benefits of the manufacturing economy, because they are manufacturing high-end technology. This isn't just like auto manufacturing, they're manufacturing chips, manufacturing a whole bunch of different medical stuff. The only thing they're not really capable of actually doing is some, well, at least it used to be, high precision steel and few things, and they never really had the technology that Taiwan had. That even though Taiwan's right there, because of somewhat of the political differences, but they're so close that they're able to to see it across the bay. They set up Shenzhen. They do all the manufacturing now. Generally speaking, they got it on lock. But they need people to buy. That's the thing. Just like we need people to buy our ideas if we become a service economy, be useful and successful. China, as far as its manufacturing exports and all that goes, needs people to buy those things. And so that's fine when every big major company in the world that is recognized with a big brand name is manufacturing in China, because China then gets a lot of that through association. They get the money just because these other brands are liked. But once you lose big brands, then you get nothing but these unknown brands. And people don't really like unknown Chinese brands. Even though a lot of stuff's made in China, people don't like it. part of it is it's a value thing. People don't like people stealing ideas here in the West because we've been so inclined to the idea of copyright. Now, I'm not a huge fan of copyright, but I do think individuals deserve protections. Where I don't think that extends is to giant companies. I think there's a limit. I think 10 years would be more than enough. 25 for copyright content, like creative content, so that you have enough time to build up a whole new generation of fans. And maybe even up to 50 years. Around 45. I think 45 years is more than enough for any particular franchise to go without additional voices. I think at a certain point, you need to let the public get access to it through public domain. A lot of people think that's going to water down the content to ruin it, and I really don't think that's true because you have fan content regardless that's always been created. And even though it can be shut down, cease and desisted, or whatever, the reason that fan content exists is because people are fans, and they want it. And if you're going to get rid of your fans, then you don't really have a product at all. And we've realized that with the last few years where companies disrespected the fans and the fans turned around and said, screw you. But you know what they didn't do? They didn't turn their back on the ideas, the concepts that started it. Take Rings of Power. It was disgusting. It was an awful adaptation, complete travesty. Anyone who was paying attention didn't have high hopes. So it should have been easy if it was a good quality piece of content to, impress them, frankly. I, for one, I was not expecting it to be good. I was expecting it to be woke washed and completely just, hollowed out husk designed solely for profit. Especially when I found out Bezos was like interested in this, I was like, oh, God, he's hyping it. He's hyping it. That means it's terrible. It's like he's done something to it. He's put his, I don't know, the special sauce of his in, and that's why he's hyping it. It's not because it's Tolkien's original work. It's because it's his, you know, rendition of it. And there's nothing wrong with people taking the renditions of it as long as they don't expect us to like it or to equivalate it to the original, right? Like I don't I don't really care if they go and they make a show called Rings of Power. And it's not that great. And it's inspired by Tolkien and all that kind of stuff. But just don't spend, $500 million on it, telling me it's better than, Lord of the Rings movie trilogy. Don't tell me that, like, Peter Jackson wasn't as good as this. None of that. Don't lie to me in the marketing. Don't also tell me it's about politics and push that marketing everywhere and then associate that with Tolkien as if the two are synonymous or as if it somehow lies in the past. Like, no, just no. It's a different piece of work. It's just different. It's an interpretation. Fine. It was a disgusting amount of money put into an interpretation that was obviously done with poor intentions. Like it was not done with a love. It was not done from the perspective of any fan. And the same thing can be said of the Matrix. And I feel like with the Matrix, it almost hurts even more when you find out that it was one of the original directors that actually, brought about the destruction in that fourth one. But in some ways, that's artists do that all the time with their work because they grow, what's the word, fed up with it. They themselves have moved beyond their work. It was a piece for them. It wasn't their life. but then it sometimes means more to the fans than it meant to the creator. And the creator wants to somehow reclaim control over that, creative control, and destroy the work to show that they are still the creator in some way and that they can take the canon and they and I mean, as much as I agree with what J.K. Rowling's been saying recently, one of the things that kind of annoyed me about J.K. Rowling is she kind of did that with the books. She wrote the books, made those books, published them, and I think they're some of the best children's literature ever written, and should go down as classics, at least in the English language, for sure, for children's books, because the world of Harry Potter is fantastic. It's well thought out. It's an epic story. It charts everything that a child wants to really go and think about. Like children really do think in school years. It's meaningful to them. They do think in terms of associations of groups, and they want to belong. Like everybody wants to belong, but I mean, like kids, man, they want to belong. That's like it's in us, you know. Like I'd say, if anything, society kind of beats a little bit of the belonging nature out of us as we get older. It kind of it scares us a little bit. It makes us, you know, put up shells and hold the world at arm's length a lot of the time. But kids, they don't have those shells if, well, if they're lucky. Some do, but I always feel bad for those kids because they've been through some shit. But, you know, most adults have the shells because most adults have seen some shit. But, you know, they've seen it over a long period of time and, you know, it's manageable. But if kids are putting up shells, I always feel bad because then, you know, something awful's happened. But um, kids just want to belong because most of them don't have those shells. And so they do just kind of hatch themselves. But I feel like, you know, with fans a lot of the time they want to associate themselves, and you know, with Harry Potter, it's all about essentially being a kid with who's both special and also, you know, not really liked by everyone because of that, right? Like every kid kind of who's gone up and talked in front of the class who has stage fright knows that feeling of like everyone's eyes are on you, but they don't necessarily like you and you don't like them all looking at you. Right? Like that kind of concept is, in my opinion, I think it's ingrained in us. Um as like a survival thing. Like we're well aware of when the group is paying attention to. And so the idea of belonging, house systems, and all that kind of stuff, of points, of it all just seems like gamifying school in a way that, well, just would be fun for pretty much anybody in general. But for kids, it makes total sense. Then you mix in magic with that. No wonder that series is fantastic. But one of the things I didn't like is that after she made that series, she went ahead and social media and started, I guess, adding facts after the fact. But the thing is, the facts were more. They, they were always related to our world, right? Like the modern day world, the events of politics or whatever that was going on, and so you you start breaking the fourth wall down, and once you start breaking that fourth wall, you bleed the worlds together with reality, and suddenly things get conflated, right? Like Dumbledore's suddenly gay, but he wasn't in the books, right? And so, as far as I'm concerned, even though officially he is, and I have no problem, I guess, if he is, it just isn't really stated in the books, in my opinion, right? And so, she had to explicitly mention that after the fact, and I always felt that the timing of that was coincide with the gay marriage stuff that was going on. And then at the same time, you know, she gets hated on for standing up for, say, women's rights and, you know, not being in favor of trans stuff. And it's strange to me. Like, I don't know. It just feels in part like she she should have had those opinions always and been allowed to have them or whatever. But that neither her modern day opinions or her old opinions or the tweets or anything should impact these stories. Right? Her feelings on her own art shouldn't impact your ability to perceive the art. Even if she, as the creator, says it means something a certain way, does not mean you can't interpret it another way. And I've always felt that with art, that the artist, sure, the artist goes in there wanting to create something. And if they don't, then, I mean, why should I even pay attention? If they didn't have any intention with their art when they were making it, why should I have any intention of consuming it? That's number one. But that being said, whatever their intention was with making it doesn't change what I'm going to perceive from it, what I'm going to take away. If I'm going to learn a lesson, I'm not going to let somebody say I can't learn that lesson because that's not the lesson they intended for me to learn. I obviously learned that lesson. You know, I could then maybe learn another lesson as well when they say, hey, no, that's not really what it's supposed to be. It's like, fine. You know, I can appreciate multiple perspectives. But what I can't appreciate is somebody saying, well, this is the way it is, and, Dumbledore's gay, all that stuff. It's like, yeah, maybe, sure, but he's not in the books, and it has no bearing. So to me, it doesn't matter. It wasn't pertinent, personally. Actually, it really doesn't matter until no, it just doesn't matter. Dumbledore dies. Like, Dumbledore dies, and it's really sad. You, I remember thinking how it was honestly kind of depressing. Because like, it wouldn't be as depressing if you just read the books in a series, but as growing up with those books being released, like you were there for a long time. So as you're kind of reading these books, as they're coming out, you spent a long time thinking about that. And then when they released the movies too, there was another idea of Dumbledore. So when Dumbledore died, at no point had it ever been mentioned about sexuality because it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. It never will matter. That for political reasons in this world, on Twitter, whatever, that's where it matters. It doesn't matter in the books, and it never will because it's not in the books. That's the point. Because he died long before that would ever have come out. So at no point would have Harry Potter ever have thought, oh, I wonder if Dumbledore's gay. No, because it wouldn't come up. It would. It just doesn't. Don't think, I wonder if my teacher's gay. It doesn't matter. These days you do. Because they've kind of gone too far. They've completely forgotten the plot. The whole point of the gay rights movement was to give people the ability to live their lives privately in peace and to just like and love whoever they please in the privacy of their own homes and their lives and to not be disrupted and just essentially go about like any normal person would. You know? If it comes up, it comes up, but it's also not something that shouldn't ever be promoted. You don't go around saying, hey, look, you're straight. Because you know what you promote? You promote a family. You promote having kids. That's what you promote because that has nothing to do with that. Now, if a person doesn't want to have kids because they're not attracted to the other person of opposite sex or whatever, I guess they don't want to have kids, and so you don't have to say that not having kids. Just promote having kids is good, right? Like promoting one thing doesn't mean the opposite. And that's the problem. You started to say that being gay is somehow you get all these special privileges with it, but you shouldn't get those privileges if you're not gay, not queer, or not whatever label you want to call yourself. It's like that's just you guys are screwed up. You guys need to stop with the labels. labels are cool when you're within the group, like your own context or whatever. Sure, call yourself what you like. Don't tell me to call it you unless I get invited into your group and all that kind of jazz. Like, just and and the same thing. I won't enforce things onto you because it generally just won't come up. The only thing I ask is a little bit of space, and I'll give you some. Pretty much it. I feel like, yeah, these days with fan loyalty is like it's under attack. It feels like there's all these groups that weren't fans to begin with that are coming in, and then they just say, "Well, I don't like that thing," and the companies used to say, "Okay, well, why don't you like it?" And it's like, "Well, it's not my kind of thing. I'm more of a like, for example, action movies, right? Like, there's a whole swath of people that don't like action movies, right? Maybe they like dramas, or they like documentaries, or romance, or comedies, or something, right? But they don't like action for whatever reason. You know, in the past, you would sometimes do a fusion, you would do a combination, and you would say, "Oh, it's a movie that seems to resonate with both, you know, comedy and action lovers," right? That can sometimes happen. You shouldn't go out of your way to say, yeah, we're gonna make a movie that's gonna target everybody. We're gonna make it so that if you like romance, there's a little bit of romance in that. If you like, oh, oh, maybe from an artistic perspective, sure, think about that. You want to balance your story or whatever, but it should always fit with the plot, with the purpose, the reason behind the story. If it's, don't make a movie of taupe. No one wants to see that bland taupe color. We want to see something different. We want something unique each time. We don't want our Star Wars becoming our Lord of the Rings. We don't want a crossover. Believe it or not, we don't. I know these metaverse people, like, get it. Okay, for all the people that think it's really, really unique to do a metaverse concept again, the reason it was unique with the Rick and Morty thing was because at the time, no one was really doing it at all. And there was this kind of pop sci, I guess, theme going through society. Like, people were really interested in this kind of pop sci, this quantum, and the idea of quantum was bringing up all this weird stuff because they're like, well, how does it change instantly, right? And then there was this idea of parallelism and all this jazz, and frankly, a lot of it just is techno new age, right? Like it's a religion slash philosophy that's really tied to technocracies. Like, that's pretty much it, and that's where I think stems from. Personally, I think that's where a lot of it stems from. Is just this kind of virality that was pushed in the pop sci culture, but you know we don't want that in our art franchises. We want actual franchises, standalones. People want to go to A&W. People want to go to McDonald's. People want to go to Burger King. They want to go to Wendy's. They want to go to Sonic. They want to go to Carl's Jr. They want to go to these places because they're different from one another. They don't want to go and get the same McDonald's everywhere. They like having McDonald's because it's McDonald's. And it is its own thing. Like, guys, just let us have what we like, okay? Let us have these franchises. Let us have uh, the fan bases that were there before. The original fan bases, the ones that grew up actually liking the content and didn't demand changes of it. Go, in a relationship, those are called low maintenance relationships. You go with the people that kind of like what you're doing. Now, there there's this like narrative out there that says that this is somehow enabling behavior, that we're enabling these fans to keep being fans, like somehow that's a bad thing. Like, no. Okay, like there's nothing wrong with these fans being the way they are. There's nothing wrong. Like, for example, if there's a group of fans, I don't know how big it is, but if there was a big group of fans, or even just a small group of fans of Conan the Barbarian, there's nothing wrong with that. You should allow people to enjoy that. At the same time, just like these weird fetishes in the queer community or all over the place, like that seems like the only thing that makes you queer is that you have like a weird interest in the bedroom. To me, that's like, I don't know. It's just like you don't I don't even know what queer means, to be honest. But that's my perception of it, at least, is that there's something weird going on in the bedroom there. But I mean, these people are just there's nothing wrong with that. They totally can do whatever they want. As long as it's in their bedroom, away, whatever the hell. I don't want that. I don't want to be invited to that. No, I'm a tradition. I'm more of a tradition. And I want a space to keep my values, keep my traditions, my culture here and around me. And I want to be able to enjoy it and be a fan of that. And I want them to be able to have their culture, their fan base or whatever as well. I want them to have to lose it. But I don't want this two-tier system that we're in right now, where they're allowed to have this sort of weird privilege class of cultural protectionism, and at the same time are then allowed to almost like expropriate space from the other cultures to make room. It, it's my problem. Like they're almost colonizing the landscape of culture. And I'm not in favor really of colonization. I'm a big fan though of unity. I think that communities need to be cohesive. They need to have shared values and shared culture. And if you don't have those, the community breaks down. And really, what you end up with is a bunch of micro communities at best, or a bunch of disparate, lonely people. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of today is just a lot more disparate loneliness in society because we're not respecting the values of all the cultures equally, even though we say we are. Because all cultures includes the existing culture and the old culture, the old way and the traditionalists and the new age and the new. But if you are not going to protect the old way, then you cannot set up protection for the new way either. You gotta let it just be a free for all. But I personally think we should just let bygones bygones. I think that there's nothing wrong with boundaries as long as the boundaries are reasonable and don't become their own entrenched legacy of for its own sake, right? Like culture should be free to evolve. It should never be held back. At the same time though, culture should not be forced to move ahead. Shouldn't be shuffling culture along and saying, well, your time's over now, architecture, but no more. It's going to be destroyed now. Yes, I said no more. And your statues, we don't want them anymore. We're just gonna. No, I know they were great. We liked them yesterday, but it's today now, and we just don't have space for these statues anymore. So we're going to destroy them. Thank you very much. We're going to add these new statues from our new group that we prefer today, and we're going to put them in because you know what, frankly, um, that's just the way we want to do it. We want to replace the culture of yesterday with the culture of today, and that is wrong. straight up wrong. Don't do that. Do not do that. Do not replace the culture of yesterday with the culture of today. Okay? They can exist simultaneously. You know, like we need to just be better at I don't know, letting bygones be bygones. Regardless. But yeah, we can't just be erasing culture. We can't be importing it either. And ultimately, regardless of where you get the people, it doesn't really matter if they don't mesh with the culture. They're bringing in their own. That's a problem. You just can't do that. You can't just throw in all these people all the time. Doesn't matter where they come from. If they're not meshing with the culture when they come in, if they're not cohesively coming together, it ruins everybody, and it starts to erode the underlying fabric. And even worse, like, you know, if there's no once the like, because the economy is one thing. You can have economic issues and all that because of corruption. A lot of that though stems from the way that the culture respects itself. You know, a society that doesn't see a future for itself is one that's going to take shortcuts, is going to try to dip out early, is going to, you know, use every loophole in the book. And that's the problem. No, you're not able to handle the I'm getting tired. You're not able to handle the value, the real desire, the real cultural glue. If that goes away in any way, shape, or form, the economy just crumbles. Like, you know, Canada, despite its small size, and I'm talking population size, not land mass, but despite its small stature and, you know, relatively small military might and all that, it had a powerful economy for a long time because it was aligned with one powerful friends. It recognized that the States was its military aid, the UK was its naval aid, and with that, Canada actually at one point was one of the most powerful Navy suppliers. We supplied so much, we did so much shipbuilding, all this stuff as a country, and we supported our allies. But then something broke down. I don't know what happened, but you know, we don't do shipbuilding anymore. And you know, there's all these other things that we've lost, and we've lost this. I don't know if it was from our fault or because of our allies not really respecting us either. But along the way, you know, we seem to have forgotten some of the important things that made Canada Canada. Some of the values. You know, we forget some of the cultural icons that we had here in this country, and we've kind of started to replace them with foreign icons, foreign ideas. And it's really strange to me. I mean, we are a country that was renowned all over the world, and yet somehow we are not going to push our culture, like be proud of our culture. No, we should be a lot more self-aware. We should recognize all the good that we've done as a country and all the innovations and all the strength. And that doesn't mean that we need to open up borders, drown that culture out, and bring in people. How do you help them? It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help Canada. You know, that ruins what Canada means. It gets rid of what it means. The rest of the world doesn't know anymore what Canada stands for. And Canadians start to forget themselves. You know, and I don't know if the States are feeling the same way, but I wouldn't be surprised, frankly. I know the UK is certainly feeling that way. France, I believe, has been feeling that way for a very long time, and they've been growing ever more aggressive, and they've been subdued or forced to undergo a lot of issues. You know, all of Europe seems to be doing that, and it's nothing against the people that are say coming in. It is, but it's not. I personally don't have any qualms with the individual people, as in people, the souls behind the people. Like they're still people. They're still humans. Their lives. They still have all that value there. I just don't want them in my life. I don't like. There's lots of people that we don't want to surround ourselves with because they're not good fits. They don't mesh well with us, and I feel that way about a lot of cultures. So I have nothing against the people. I just don't want to live like them, and I don't want their values supplanting any of the way that society was before. If they want to live that way, they can't do it here. That's what I'm saying. They can do it somewhere else. They can do it wherever they were doing it because obviously some place allowed them to do this. So some place is conducive to that culture. So why don't they go where it's conducive to that culture? And I'm serious. Like, culture is far more important than geography. Now, I don't care on the map where they have to go. But they need to go where people are going to appreciate them. It's like we need to be surrounded by people that are going to appreciate us. And we can't merge these groups. We can't blend them in. They're not colors. Hey, guys, we're not colors. We don't blend. We don't mix. We're not paint. Okay? We are patches on a quilt. We are individual patches on a quilt. We are unique. We customize our patches how we like, and then we sew them beside one another. But we are patches on a quilt. We are not paints. We do not blend and mix. But you know what society is? If you do try to blend and mix society, you take a quilt and you throw it into a shredder and a blender. And you blend it all up, and you take that beautiful quilt with all those nice, intricate, unique patterns in every single one of them. And a nice place, a nice value to add, a uniqueness, a contrast. And you blend it all up and you destroy that beautiful quilt and you just get shredded like stuffing and waste out of it. And it just looks gray and drab and you don't know what anything was anymore. And you remember in your head fondly the way that it used to be. It's not the way it is anymore. Because you've gone and shredded it all up, and you can't unshred it when you've shredded it up. That's the thing too, guys. We can't unblend it once you've destroyed it. You gotta respect the culture. We used to have museums for this reason. You'd go to a museum, you'd learn about the other cultures. They would have exhibits that would come through. They would work. There would be all this kind of stuff. You had tourism, guys. You would go and learn about other cultures, visit them, but they wouldn't come back with you, except for in like tokens, small items and trophies, or little souvenirs. That's what you would take back. We just gotta remember the way it was. It was so much healthier back then. We did a lot more with a little bit less. And these days, we're just trying to achieve too much. We're not really acknowledging the real constraints and the real things that we're losing, the real costs. Okay? The cost isn't just land, it isn't just house. It's history, culture, values, language. It's all of this. And it's totally fine to have immigration, but we got to bring the levels down, and it's got to be back to the way it used to be. You would immigrate people in who were good cultural fits, shared the values, had an established, well, like were going to sustain themselves and promote good, healthy economy. We're not going to erode the cultural barriers and boundaries that were between different countries, especially if those countries were different. And if these people would come in, they should be more like us in that sense. You know, they don't have to be 100% like us, but they need to be more like our values than they are like values they wish to leave, which is the reason that they wish to leave. But again, there's some economic constraints here, but in the world today, with remote work, we need to be keeping the cultures, the actual people themselves, more where they are and sending the money into those places then, if that's the case. Again, these people can do work, just don't want my community changing so that I can, I don't know, make a politician's caucus get a slightly different demographic so that they can get guaranteed votes. I just don't want that. I want my community to be vibrant, healthy, innovative. I want it to push for like a whole bunch of greatness, and I want to do it for us first. Us first. Then we can be models for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world can look at us and go, "Wow, look at those Canadians! Look what they're doing up there. They seem to be doing a lot of good. Man, we should be more like Canada. Not we should run away to Canada. I don't want that. I don't want to be promoting this idea that yeah, come to Canada and you can have all this. I don't want to promote that. I want to promote yeah, buy Canadian. You want this? Buy it from us. You like it? Yeah, you can have it too. Buy it from us. That's what I want. Buy our good ideas. Buy them. Import our ideas into your country. Keep your culture, import our products, our ideas, whatever. You gotta keep your culture, we gotta keep our culture. Just I don't want to import culture. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of importing like you know I want Canada to be allowed to be proud of itself again. But yeah, that's all I pretty much had to say for now. Obviously, there's going to be lots of discussion over the last half of this month. Because when you think about it, I mean, Putin's interview, I've only watched the first 40 minutes of it, so I got to go back and finish it up. But I did like the history lesson. I do have concerns with it. I mean, uh, I'll say this. If you're going to use history to justify things, then you're essentially drawing lines in the sand and defining dates. And my concern is that unless it's universally agreed upon, there's always going to be some ability to go back and draw another line in the sand. So I'm of the opinion that if you are going to draw lines in the sand, you draw the line in the sand that's the most recent, and you always have the option to draw a new line in the sand. And if you're going to draw a new line in the sand, that's fine. But it should be justified, and you shouldn't go back and justify it by using a previous line in the sand, saying, well, we drew the line back there then. That's not a good reason, you know? Like, you did draw the line back there then. You shouldn't forget that. You shouldn't disregard that. But then you drew the line here, and then you drew the line there, and yes, you weren't alive, neither were they. And so now that both of you guys are alive, why don't you guys draw the line somewhere? Why do you have to use the past only to draw the line if you guys are having cultural differences. Now, that being said, I'm not there on the ground. So based on what I've just said, if one of these countries is trying to, say, erase or erode a culture by importing like we are, which I don't know if they were doing that at all, but let's say that was the case, and another country was trying to protect its culture, then again, I believe in culture, not geography. So I don't really care where the lines are drawn on the map, as long as the people living there are generally culturally relevant and happy and all that stuff. So I don't really care if Ukraine disappears or if it stays, gets smaller, gets bigger. I really don't care. Because to me, all that matters is like, well, do the people living there, does it make sense for them? Because if the borders are geographically misaligned with the culture, then frankly, I don't think that should be that way. I don't think that you should have geography determine where the cultural boundaries are, you know? I think cultural boundaries need to be protected for sure. So, yeah, I think we do need to kind of acknowledge where the cultural boundaries are, but I don't think we should be keeping them in stone um, geographically. So I need to finish the Putin interview again. So I could be jumping the gun here, but I, I kind of see what he's saying with this historical relevance because a lot of it was tied to culture. It seemed like his idea of what a Russian people are seems to be more tied, in my mind, to cultural boundaries that had historical relevance. So it seems like he's pointing to times in the past, saying, look, at this time in the past, these were boundaries that were Russian, and the culture and the boundaries aligned. That's to me how I interpreted that first 30, 40 minutes. Is that he's saying that at a time when Catherine the Great, it seems, or Katerina, I can't remember now, whenever she was reigning, it seems like he's saying there was a good alignment between Russian values and the Russian border. And if that's what he's saying, and that's true, then I kind of agree with him, generally speaking, because that's kind of what I'm saying. I do believe that culture and geography and all that should match. That's why I don't think Western Canada really is the same as Eastern Canada. I don't think the prairies, and I'd say the same thing about the Midwest and the U.S. I think the Western and the Midwest of the U.S., all the areas that were settled primarily by the settlers, going out and staking claims through homesteading and all that, I think the homesteaders had a unique culture. And that homesteading culture stuck around a little bit more in the West than it ever saw in the East. Because the thing is, the homesteading culture didn't really live or exist in the East. Because the initial homesteaders in the East came by boat, right? They came by boat. They were some of the, let's say, the politically powerful families. They were typically military based families, because that's how they were over there in the first place. And so when you think about it, the type of people that settled on the East Coast were a lot different than the people that settled Western Canada and Western United States, because the people that settled Western United States came like 100 odd years later to 200 years later, to in some cases maybe even 300 years later, depending on which parts of the East Coast I guess you look at. And then they settled it long after the establishment of the Eastern colonies. And so when you think about those Eastern colonies, it's almost like a different history. I mean, that's really the history of the United States. We're mostly told is from the perspective of those Eastern colonies. The Western had its own culture, the Wild West. right? And everybody who's seen movies thinks of the Western movies and all that, but I mean, the homesteading culture was a, a culture, you know, it was somewhat of a lifestyle in the sense that people went out and they staked the land, they went out there and claimed it, and there was this idea of land ownership, but the idea of also establishing your own setup, and it was going to be more rural. I mean, they were kind of leaving behind bigger society in the east to establish their own colonies out west. And at first, these were trading posts and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it's just a different culture. So even the West and the East, in my mind, have always just been vastly different. So whenever you look at the Eastern states, everything there, all their history is so military, it's so politically driven, everything is so historical. And I feel that Europe has a lot of that too. Everything is very historical. But as you move into, say, Western Canada, and when you move into the Western and Midwest of the United States and farther down, it starts turning more into this wild Western way of doing things. Small scale, more independent, right wing, but this kind of conservative, small scale way of living. Conservative by our standards, not conservative by their standards, right? Like there was a shift. The conservatives back then were like, in theory, they would have been loyalists, right? And so, I mean, maybe some of them were going out homesteading because they didn't want to be around the East. But I mean, it was different politically, right? So we can't think about it that way. But by today's standards, that conservative mindset, that smaller town, family oriented, homesteading kind of lifestyle came mostly out of the West. It's definitely more of a Midwestern, Western feel. And I don't think it has its roots as much in the East at all because they weren't even there. Like, even if you look at the history, they didn't establish homesteading rights, they didn't do all that kind of stuff out on the Eastern colonies. It was something that they did as a way to promote settlements. They wanted to push people out into the frontiers. And in order to do that, they needed to give them a reason to go out into the wilderness. And so they said, okay, well, you can have some land and go, be gone. And people did. And so it's just a different group of people, though. And so I think even the culture of this country and all that is not one unit. But over time, it got a unique identity. The States has their flag and their anthem. Canada got their anthem and our flag over the last in the last 100 years, and so we have like this idea, this identity, and it kind of does unite people. But as soon as the values stop being shared amongst the people, those icons don't really mean anything anymore, and they start to become almost parodies, cruel parodies in a way, because they remind you of what was and what no longer is. And so I do think it is important that boundaries and cultures are protected. And so if Russia and the Russian people and the people in those areas identify as Russian, then by all means, I don't see any issue with changing the boundaries, giving them their identity, and reuniting them that way. Just how I feel that generally speaking, it's kind of hypocritical then for Putin in the same conversation to complain about Nazism in Ukraine. I do think that's somewhat hypocritical. Now, again, I don't know anything about the actual situation down there. So if the Nazis are more like terrorists that have been planted there to cause disturbances, then yeah, sure. I mean, getting rid of them makes total sense. But I mean, if they're just like Nazis, but really they're just Aryan, people that are proud of their heritage, considering that came out of the steppes area, which is right in that vicinity. I mean, I think that's different, you know? So I don't know. I think there's some, again, I do think nothing wrong with having cultural separation. So I just think it's a bit hypocritical for Putin to then complain, say, hey, look, we were trying to make Russia great. We want to have our cultural lines, but we're going to also wipe out these Nazis down here. And it's just like, again, bygones be bygones. Like, I don't even know if the term Nazi is a good fit, but if the Nazis like being Nazis and be their own Nazis in their own little space, they're not bothering other people, fuck, I don't care. Like, I don't care if the Russians want to have their own little Russian. I kind of like that, frankly. I kind of want them both. I kind of want little Nazia and little Russia and little Ukraine and little Italy and all those places. I like the variation. I like the difference. The thing is, I don't want to live in any of them. I want to live here in Canada. Under the 1990s to 2000s Canada that I grew up in as a kid, that I remember, the Lanny McDonald, the Terry Fox Canada, the Maple Leafs, the Olympics, skiing, hockey, just friendly, polite, smart, hardworking, with their English, with their kind of, oh, don't you know, eh? Oh, what about that, eh? All those kind of fun little accents. That's what I like, the Aboriginals, the all those different groups kind of being there, but not hating on Canada like they do today. Just being a part of it, being part of the Leaf. I always thought, I always liked the Maple Leaf as a design because it had the different points on it, right? And so you got the three main leaves, but then each one's also got like the three shapes, and then you got the two little the bits on the bottom. But I always liked the shape of that leaf because I always thought that kind of represented the different points of our culture. Right? We as Canada are represented by a kind of a weird split in different ways. We've got French, we've got English, we've got some American in there. That's a little stem at the bottom, right? There's definitely some American there, and then we've got the Aboriginal First Peoples that are all in different groups as well, and each one of those kind of is their own little fractal little point along on the leaves. And I think that all these different cultures, like if you think about it, really, it's like English, French, and then Native Americans, kind of central culture there, and then, like I said, America down here. To me, that's always been Canada. It's always felt that the Leaf was a great example of different but united points of view. And yet these days, it's more like they want to have a different leaf for everybody, different color, different. It's like I don't want that. I like the way that Canada was in the 1990s through the 2000s, before all the craziness, and I would say even before Harper and Paul Martin, I would say up to John Chrétien. I think Chrétien was I think Canada during Chrétien was somewhat respected. I think Paul Martin lost us a lot of respect, and then Harper had to get some of it back, but by the end wasn't able to really hold on to it. So I think Chrétien, that's where I would keep Canada at. And I mean, certainly not perfect, but I don't know. I feel like back then it was better. Culture was more cohesive. Felt like if you were to ask the average Canadian back then, what makes you happy about Canada, everyone would have had something to say. What are your thoughts on Canada? Almost all of it would have been positive. If anything, they would have maybe said be more aggressive, or we're just, we're not loud enough on the global stage or something. And you know what? Who cares? Honestly, who cares if we're not that loud, but we got a good life going on here. Again, like I said, people will eventually see what's good and will try to replicate. But if you let people destroy what's good, no one will have it, and everyone will be bitter and angry. Don't be a crab in the bucket. Don't let our country become the crabs in the bucket. Anyways, so thanks everybody. Appreciate anyone who tunes in and watches random live stream. Until next time.